Down through the chimney came old fantasy Matt Donnelly here to drop some fantasy tidbits here ahead of week number 16 with the Fantasy Points Friday Night Hype Show. Hey, we are coming at you a little bit earlier this week because we are loaded with games on Saturday. We have games on Sunday. We just had a game on Thursday. There's games on Monday. This is the NFL's holiday spirit here. You get a little bit of everything. And you know what? We're going to give you more here at Fantasy Points because if you sign up today, that is 30% off your Fantasy Points subscription. So you don't want to miss out on that because, hey, there's no better stocking stuffer than a Fantasy Points subscription. That being said, we are going to talk about the games that I am hyped to talk about here in week number 16, starting with the New York Giants versus the Minnesota Vikings. We got the Las Vegas Raiders and the Pittsburgh Steelers. We got the Philadelphia Eagles taking on the Dallas Cowboys, and the Green Bay Packers. They are heading to South Beach, a little Christmas vacation in the sun, taking on the Miami Dolphins. But before we get into these contests, before I preview the best games of the week, we have to go through the injury report, especially how it pertains to your fantasy football rosters there. Kyler Murray, Colt McCoy, both are out this week. So it looks like you're going to get Trace McSorley under center. Lamar Jackson, he's already out. That means Tyler Snoop Huntley will be under center for the Ravens this week. Jalen Hurts, shoulder injury there, that sprained AC joint, he's going to be out. That means Gardner Minshew is under center for the Philadelphia Eagles. Jonathan Taylor, he's got that ankle injury. He is on the IR. He has been lost for the season. So if you're looking for a pivot there, Deion Jackson in PPR, Zach Moss in standard leagues. Devin Duvernay, foot injury, IR as well. Ryan Tannehill, right ankle. Do not expect him to play. That means more Malik Willis for the Tennessee Titans. Damian Harris, he's still battling a little bit of that thigh injury there. Russell Wilson is still in concussion protocol. He could be cleared for the game this week, but you know what? It'd probably be a Christmas miracle to see him on the field on Sunday. Now we got Deebo Samuel. He's out for the rest of the season with that knee injury. He's going to be back for the 49ers playoffs more than likely. Nico Collins, Brandon Cooks, they are both out as well. Well, they're not technically out. They are doubtful, but I'd be shocked to see one or both of them play this week. Chase Claypool, he's got that knee injury. We've also got Cortland Sutton still dealing with that hamstring injury. So for him to play on Christmas, again, I don't see that happening. Now, some of these other games, but hey, if you aren't 100% sure who's in and who's out, make sure to check in with our very own DPT there, Edwin Porras there on Fantasy Points, and check out that Fantasy Points podcast for the latest injury updates ahead of week number 16. Now let's get into week number 16. Let's talk about some of these other contests, starting with Atlanta at Baltimore on Saturday. Dobbins, he may not be Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, but after back-to-back 100-yard rushing performances, he and the Ravens run game drive this Ravens sleigh tonight in Lamar Jackson's absence. Hey, a lot of people used to make fun of Rudolph and that red nose. A lot of people are making fun of J.K. Dobbins and that running style, but hey, it's getting the job done. As for Drake London and Desmond Ridder, they have eyes for one another, and you know where the ball is going as Ridder targeted London. 11 out of the 26 passing attempts went that direction there in week number 16. Detroit at Carolina, cat fight. Hey, there's no fighting around Christmas, but with playoff implications on the line, I'll let it slide this week. For both the Panthers and the Lions, yes, believe it or not, they are both in that playoff hunt. A win for the Lions could propel them into that final NFC playoff spot, along with a little bit of help there, while the 5-9 Panthers, with a win coupled with a Buccaneers loss, it could have the Panthers sitting tied for the top spot in that AFC South. Now, that just doesn't sound right, but hey, Christmas is the season of miracles, so maybe the Panthers can find themselves in a tie for first after this week. Buffalo at Chicago. The weather outside is frightful, but the run game this week is going to be delightful. Josh Allen versus Justin Fields, sub-zero temperatures. I expect both teams to run the ball and run the ball effectively. Remember, Raheem Mostert there last week, 136 yards against this Bills defense. Tackling, it hits a little bit different in these negative temperatures. In other words, don't worry about the weather when you're considering who you're going to start this week. If you're going to start them in their dome, you can start them tonight. Now, New Orleans at Cleveland. You know what? I'm going to follow the trend here. Donovan Peoples-Jones has recorded 13 or more fantasy points in 3 straight contests, which is impressive considering how underwhelming the return of Deshaun Watson has been. He's basically a lump of coal in your stocking, except that lump of coal might actually keep you warm at night, whereas Watson, he's just giving you fantasy frostbite. Seattle at Kansas City. Jerick McKinnon has been roasting chestnuts over an open fire recently, and he has been heating up this holiday season with 5 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks and back-to-back 30-point fantasy performances. Special shout out to friend of the show there, Geno Smith, for earning that bag and securing $500K with 20-plus touchdowns this season and his first Pro Bowl selection. Cincinnati at the New England Patriots. I think it's safe to say that I don't think we're going to see a lateral pass this week, especially on the New England side of things. The game plan for the Patriots should be hand the ball up to Ramondre Stevenson 40-plus time and see what happens. Whatever happens, it happens. Now, Stevenson, he is coming off a season-high 172-yard performance against the Raiders. New England, hey, they are a tough defense for fantasy purposes, but you simply don't sit Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow when your fantasy playoffs are on the line. Houston at Tennessee. It's so nice of the Texans to play Secret Santa for Derrick Henry, except we already know what they're going to get him, and in all likelihood, it's going to be another 200-yard rushing performance on the ground. The good news is, hey, maybe Brandon Cooks does come back. Maybe Nico Collins comes back, but I doubt it. Washington at San Francisco on Dancer and Prancer and Pro Bowl snub Christian McCaffrey. That's right, you heard that correctly. The NFC leader in total yards was left off the Pro Bowl roster in favor of Saquon Barkley, in favor of Miles Sanders, in favor of Tony Pollard. Now, it may not be a traditional revenge game, so to speak, but I'm expecting McCaffrey to go full Grinch on the Commanders this week. Now on Christmas, we have the Vegas Raiders there and the Pittsburgh Steelers in the Christmas Classic. More on that here a little bit later. But we got the Denver Broncos at the Los Angeles Rams. Yes, the NFL hates us, and they know that we're going to watch anything that they put on TV, and that includes Baker Mayfield. That includes the Denver Broncos, which basically is this year's version of fantasy fruitcake. This game is literally fruitcake. Like, there's no other way around it. The Broncos versus the Rams game is technically, it's still football. While fruitcake, like it or lump it, it is still part of Christmas. Now, Tampa Bay at Arizona, Brady's legacy, could it be on the line each and every week? Or at least I want to make more of this narrative than maybe is really out there. Last week's loss went up by 17 points against the Bengals. He blew that 17-point lead at home. He was previously 89-0 when leading by 17 points at home. The Buccaneers, they need to win out to avoid Brady's first ever losing record. Yet, the Buccaneers, they still remain in first place with only 6 wins. It doesn't even make sense. Now, we also got a Boxing Day contest here. Los Angeles Chargers at the Indianapolis Colts. Justin Herbert, first player in NFL history with 4,000 yards passing in each of his first 3 seasons. Nick Foles thinks that's cute. It would be a shame if someone, you know what, never mind. Now let's get into the games of the week, the 4 matchups that have me hyped for Christmas, starting with the New York Giants versus the Minnesota Vikings. After a big win last week against the Washington Commanders, the New York Giants put themselves in a good position to make the playoffs. Now at 8-5-1, they have a little bit of breathing room on the 7-6-1 Commanders, the 7-7 Seattle Seahawks, and the 7-7 Detroit Lions. However, this week, they face the Minnesota Vikings team, which is as unpredictable as any team in recent memory. Heck, in history of the NFL, after a 39-36 overtime thriller last week in which the Vikings overcame a 33-0 deficit in order to defeat the Colts, the Vikings find themselves at 11-3, which sounds good until you consider their +2 points differential. For the New York Giants, if you are into fantasy football, then Daniel Jones, he may be the one looking to deliver those fantasy gifts this week, maybe those fantasy championships to your stockings in this holiday season. Okay, pretty much any quarterback receiver combination facing the Vikings defense should have fantasy managers seeing sugar plums this week. The Vikings are allowing the 3rd and 7th most fantasy points on a per game basis this season to the wide receiver and the quarterback positions. So you know that they are in the giving mood. That means expect Daniel Jones to continue to target and hook up with Darius Slayton this week with a little Richie James and Isaiah Hodgins mixed in there. From a yards per target viewpoint there, Darius Slayton has been elite, averaging 10.2 yards per target, which trails only Jalen Waddle and Justin Jefferson in that category this season. Slayton also ranks inside the top 20 in both receiving yards, 523, and a yardage share of 28.4% since week number 7, while being targeted just 50 times, which is the 32nd most in the league. If you don't want to trust Daniel Jones, hey, I get it. This Giants roster on paper is one of the worst in the league, top to bottom. Yet somehow, like a Christmas miracle, they are making it happen. They are getting the job done, mostly in large part thanks to Saquon Barkley. Last week, Barkley finished with 87 yards on the ground, which worked out to about 4.8 yards per carry, which is his best since week number 5. And he also added 33 more yards on 5 receptions. On the season, the Vikings, they have allowed 1,132 yards on the ground to opposing backs. However, they have also allowed 609 yards receiving to the position, which happens to be the 5th most in the league. If the Giants have the ball, there's probably a pretty good chance that they are going to score, as the Vikings have allowed their opponents to score on 45% of their possessions over the last 11 games, which is also the second highest rate in the NFL. For the Minnesota Vikings, Kirk Cousins is heating up after back-to-back 400-yard plus passing performances. His 38-18 as far as passing yards is concerned, it sits 6th in the NFL. This season, quarterbacks have thrown for 425 yards and 2 touchdowns just 4 times, with Cousins having been responsible for 2 of those marks. The thing that the Vikings must figure out is how to protect their quarterback. Last week against the Colts, Cousins was sacked 7 times. And if you recall, Kayvon Thibodeau, he has been a man-possessed, registering 9 solo tackles, a sack, a fumble recovery, a forced fumble there, and a touchdown last week against the Commanders. The Vikings are going to have to find a way to get a body on him and Dexter Lawrence. Now, we all know what Justin Jefferson can do, but the one thing he can't do is protect Kirk Cousins inside that pocket. But Dalvin Cook, he can. Look for the Vikings to continue to get Cook more involved in this offense in order to take that pressure off of Cousins this week. Now, I doubt that Cook has another 95-yard rushing, 95-yard receiving performance this week, but the more touches that Cook gets, that means the fewer times that Kirk Cousins is going to end up getting hit. This week, Cook has one of the best matchups for running backs, according to Joe Dolan and the Week 16 mismatch report over on fantasypoints.com. Dolan would go on to say that Dalvin Cook is coming off a massive game against the Colts in the Vikings' all-time comeback, and he gets the single worst yards per contact per attempt defense in the NFL with the Giants this week. The Giants' 3.04 YBC per attempt allowed over the last 5 weeks is 0.66 above the second worst Seattle Seahawks. So Cook is clearly primed to carry your fantasy squads in the playoffs this week. Now, we all know that TJ Hawkinson has been a great addition to this Vikings roster, but last week it was KJ Osborne that stepped up. If the Vikings can get Osborne more involved, they become even more dangerous, as they have too many weapons that the Giants have to deal with. Now, Osborne, he led the Vikings in that comeback victory against the Colts last week, hauling in 10 passes for 157 yards and a score, while Justin Jefferson hauled in 12 for 123. Now, moving along to the Las Vegas Raiders versus the Pittsburgh Steelers in the Christmas Classic. Now, with the recent passing of Pittsburgh Steelers Hall of Famer Franco Harris here on the 50th anniversary of what many are considering one of the greatest plays in NFL history there, the Immaculate Reception. I felt it was important to speak on this contest in particular, as it is, after all, the NFL's Christmas Classic and was a Christmas miracle 50 years ago. You can trace the Steelers dynasty of the 70s back to December 23rd, 1972. Steelers fans, Raiders fans alike are very familiar with what took place on this date. And you cannot tell the history of the NFL without bringing up the Immaculate Reception, for better or for worse. Franco Harris was much more than just that catch. A 4-time Super Bowl champion who would go on to score a touchdown in each of the Steelers' Super Bowl victories. The general of the Italian army who would go on to almost 13,000 rushing yards, and which at the time of his retirement was the 3rd most in NFL history. He also recorded 91 rushing touchdowns, 8 1,000-yard seasons there, and 354 rushing yards in the Super Bowl, which is more than any other running back in NFL history. Now, before we talk about the Steelers, let's talk about the Raiders here. Darren Waller, Hunter Renfrow, they both returned to the Raiders lineup there last week. And while I caution people not to start Renfrow during your fantasy football players, Waller, on the other hand, is a different story. Not because he was good last week, but because the tight end position is a complete crapshoot. With the return of Waller and Renfrow, it appeared as though Devontae Adams snuck back up the chimney and simply disappeared with the milk and cookies. You knew Adams was there last week, but you didn't see him. One game does not make a season, and as Adams, he sits 7th in receptions with 86, 3rd in targets with 151, 4th in receiving yards with 1,275. You know what? I can't help but be impressed with what Justin Jefferson's 16-23 and Tyreek Hill's 15-29. Anyway, Adams, he's also tied with Travis Kelce for the most receiving touchdowns with 12. And it's not like Adams hasn't been targeted. Last week he had 12 of them, but McDaniels and this Raiders team, they need to do a better job of getting him easy targets, much like the Packers did on screens last season. Now, despite the Steelers' success against receivers in recent weeks, they are still allowing the 6th most fantasy points on a per game basis this season and have allowed 16 touchdowns, 2,454 yards to receivers this season. As for Derek Carr, he quietly put together a 3-touchdown, 231-yard passing performance and now sits 11th in passing yards with 3,348 and 8th in touchdowns with 23. Just when you start to think that the Raiders should just cut bait with Derek Carr, he drops an absolute dime to Keelan Cole. Just when you start to believe in him again, he tosses a pick 6. Like many, I go back and forth on where I evaluate Derek Carr, but the one constant remains. Who else is out there? Carr's 10 games this season of 2 or more touchdown passes sits tied with Joe Burrow and Patrick Mahomes for the second most in the league. One back of Geno Smith, who has done this 11 times. But can Carr avoid TJ Watt this week? That's yet to be seen. Against a tough Patriots defense, Josh Jacobs, he still cranked out 93 yards on the ground, 17 more in the air. I mean, the guy's been that good. That's probably why he is a Pro Bowl player this season, and he leads the NFL in rushing yards with 1,495 on 291 attempts. That's nearly 200 more rushing yards than Derrick Henry, who sits second. The Steelers, to their credit, have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to backs over the last 4 weeks and have limited opposing ball carriers to just 2 touchdowns and 425 yards on the ground. Now, for Pittsburgh, it appears as though Kenny Pickett is set to return this week after Mitchell Trubisky stepped in under center in the Steelers' 24-16 victory over the Panthers a week ago. Apparently, Trubisky heard Deontay Johnson calling for Mason Rudolph and decided just to pepper the young receiver with 10 targets, with Johnson turned into 98 yards and 20 fantasy points, which was a season high. Now, Max Crosby is 4th among edge rushers with 62 pressures. He's 1st in stops with 52. While Chandler Jones is tied for 16th in pressures with 46 and has 4 sacks, 9 quarterback hits, a forced fumble, and a pair of fumble recoveries in the last 3 weeks. So welcome back, Kenny Pickett. Now, per Scott Baird's usage report here for week number 16, Deontay Johnson is coming off his best performance of the season. He ranks 12th among all wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game at 16.1, but still just 41st in fantasy points per game at 11. He also still ranks as the single least efficient player in fantasy with a par of negative 5.1, but contributing to the notion of that targets are earned and shifting the blame to poor quarterback play, he still ranks top 4 according to ESPN's open rate for the 3rd straight season in a row. Now, with Kenny Pickett likely returning, Johnson will likely see his target share dip from 30% with Mitchell Trubisky back down to around 23% with Kenny Pickett. While the return of Pickett probably hurts Deontay Johnson, it helps George Pickens, who hasn't seen 8 targets in a game since way back in week number 5. Against the Bills in week 5 and the Jets in week 4, Pickens had 185 receiving yards. In each of those contests, he saw at least 8 targets. Simple math would say target George Pickens and the yardage is going to add up. Now, conventional wisdom would also say start Pat Freiermuth against the Raiders. The Raiders can't defend the tight end position. And while that may be true over the last 4 weeks, they have allowed the 12th fewest points to the tight end position. And Freiermuth simply has not seen the targets to make you comfortable in starting him this week. Now, it's probably likely due to that foot injury there because Freiermuth has seen 60% or fewer of the snaps in each of the last 3 contests. On this week's show, we want to celebrate Franco Harris, and one of the best ways to do so during this video is to talk about Steelers backs. Najee Harris is coming off a 24-carry, 86-yard performance against the Panthers, in which he also hit pay dirt, while Jaylen Warren added 38 yards on the ground and 11 more on that reception. Najee Harris has produced 85 or more yards on the ground in 4 of 6 contests. Even if the yardage hasn't always been adding up at the end of the day, Harris has managed to save fantasy managers with a timely score, scoring in 5 of those last 6 contests, including finding the end zone twice back on November 20th against the Cincinnati Bengals. Good news, Ramondre Stevenson, we just watched him run for 172 yards against the Raiders last week. Now, moving along to the Philadelphia Eagles and the Dallas Cowboys game. The Eagles need one more win in their final 3 contests to secure home field throughout the playoffs. However, this week they are turning their attention here under center to Gardner Minshew, who will be looking to get the job done against the Cowboys team coming off a tough loss at the hands of the Jacksonville Jaguars just a week ago. At 10-4, the Dallas Cowboys have already clinched a playoff spot, and in all likelihood will face the winner of the NFC South, which currently is those 6-8 Buccaneers. Looks like Minshew Mania fires up one more time this week as the mustache-sporting, jort-wearing quarterback will be under center for the Eagles this week. More on him in just a moment. First, another bit of history to attend to. Last week, it was Jalen Hurts who ran the ball in 3 times, giving him 13 rushing touchdowns this season, one shy of Cam Newton's record. Now, per NFL research, this is also Hurts' 8th career game with multiple rushing touchdowns. This is only his 3rd NFL season. This breaks a tie for the second most by a quarterback since 1950, and it sits only behind Cam Newton. Now, back to Gardner Minshew. He's officially taking over, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing when it comes to A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, or Miles Sanders. In fact, it may actually increase their fantasy values this week as they don't have to worry about Minshew rushing the ball into the end zone multiple times. Yes, this is a pro Miles Sanders tweet here as far as I'm concerned, or a Miles Sanders video. He may not care about your fantasy squads, but in the holiday spirit, I care about him. Last week, Sanders carried the ball 11 times for 42 yards. He did fumble the ball, which kind of hurt some fantasy managers there. Meanwhile, Hurts, he attempted 17 carries, resulting in 3 touchdowns and 61 yards. So you have to figure some of that production is going to shift towards Miles Sanders. Now, it's easy to see where this is going to benefit him compared with Hurts missing this week. In Minshew's lone start last season with the first team offense, Sanders hit a season high 27 touchdowns and scored 20.2 fantasy points. Now for Minshew, he may be playing on a different level this week after delivering a eulogy for his former college coach there in Mike Leach just a couple days ago, and he's looking to earn that contract moving into next season. Not to start anything here, but Scott Barrett, he took to the Twitter streets there to point out that Gardner Minshew over his career has averaged 17.8 fantasy points per start, while Justin Herbert this season is averaging just 17.7 fantasy points per start. And I'm not saying what I'm not saying, but you're hearing what you're hearing. Now, according to fantasy points metrics, both Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown have top 5 matchups by our metrics. As Trevor Lawrence and Zay Jones showed last week, if the quarterback can be protected against this Dallas front, then Dallas, their back end, it can be picked apart. According to the DVOA metrics, Miles Sanders, he checks all the boxes and could be argued as the best back in the NFL right now. I said you could argue that, but personally I wouldn't. I would just kind of bite my tongue. But he does sit 5th in rushing the season with 1,110 yards on just 215 carries with 11 rushing scores, which is tied for the 5th most amongst backs there, and that's tied with Josh Jacobs. Now, Eagles fans, you probably already know this, but the franchise record there for victories in a single season, that sits at 13. In 2004, the Eagles, they won 13 games and they would end up losing in the Super Bowl. Then in 2017, they would go on to another 13-win season there, and this time they would hoist that Lombardi trophy. For the Dallas Cowboys, speaking of backs, Ezekiel Elliott, Tony Pollard are each coming off 3 consecutive weeks in which they have produced at least 14 fantasy points. And don't look now, but Tony Pollard, a.k.a. the Pro Bowl back there, he's just 31 yards shy of 1,000 rushing yards this season, which would be a first for him, while Ezekiel Elliott is sitting just 140 yards away from his 7th consecutive 1,000-yard total season. Now, crazier yet, I had to double check this, but Elliott has a touchdown now in 7 straight games. Now, nothing will change this week as far as the Cowboys' backfield is concerned. Expect the touches and opportunities to be basically split down the middle, with Elliott receiving a majority of the red zone work, while Pollard will be on the receiving end of all the passing down work this week, which could add up quickly against a tough Eagles defense that has been good against backs in recent weeks. Those worried about CeeDee Lamb this week against James Bradbury and Darius Slay, relax. The last time that the Eagles and the Cowboys met up, Lamb saw 10 targets, hauling in 5 of them for 68 yards. Expect Lamb to see a majority of his snaps continue to come out of the slot, where the matchup is a little bit more favorable against Avonte Maddox. Lamb has also seen an uptick in volume when the Cowboys are facing man coverage, where he has a 34.2% target rate per route run this season. All that adds up to Lamb sitting 8th in the NFL with 1,087 receiving yards, while hauling in 81 of 124 targets. Some of those courtesy of some dude named Cooper Rush. Remember him? Well, if Dak Prescott doesn't start finding a little bit more consistency and start throwing fewer picks, those memories of Cooper Rush may start rushing back into Dallas Cowboys fans' minds here as early as this week. Prescott, He has been a QB 15 or worse in 2 of his last 4 starts there. And since he has returned from injury, PFF has him ranked 19th in their passer grades and sitting 26th in big time throw rate and 19th in adjusted completion rate. It won't be easy facing an Eagles front that deploys the 6th highest pressure rate this season. And finally, the last matchup here, we are going to take Christmas. We're going on a Christmas vacation here. We are heading south to the Green Bay Packers, heading to Miami to take on the Miami Dolphins. Now, the Packers, they aren't out of it technically yet, but a loss against the Dolphins on Christmas Day could ruin their playoff aspirations. At 6-8, the Packers are on the outside looking in and need plenty of help in order to sneak back into the playoffs. And I'm guessing the Dolphins, they really aren't in the holiday spirit unless you consider handing out L's is better to give than to receive in their minds. Now, Miami, they currently sit 7th and have the final playoff spot in the AFC at 8-6, tied with the Los Angeles Chargers as they attempt to move up the standings in order to avoid a first-round date with either Kansas City or Buffalo. For Green Bay, I hope Santa is bringing Aaron Rodgers some fantasy points this Christmas per Graham Barfield stat pack on fantasypoints.com. Aaron Rodgers still has not scored more than 20 fantasy points in any game this season. He has not thrown for more than 230 yards in 5 straight contests. I'm not saying that Aaron Rodgers has great weapons to work with, but Allen Lazard, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Randall Cobb, that has to be an upgrade over whatever Daniel Jones has had to work with all season long. Lazard leads the Packers with 46 receptions, 627 yards, while Watson leads the way with 7 receiving touchdowns. But let's face it, this Packers run game is what sets everything up. Aaron Jones is closing in 1,000-yard rushing season. He needs just 63 yards this week to accomplish that feat, which should also happen considering that he averages 5.2 yards per carry. Meanwhile, A.J. Dillon is basically a human version of a snowplow who has run the ball into the end zone 5 times this season, including twice against the Rams last week on just 11 attempts. I know everyone's talking about Christian McCaffrey being a snub from that Pro Bowl roster, and rightfully so. But why are we talking about Aaron Jones, who has 10 more rushing yards than Christian McCaffrey does on 10 fewer carries? Now, my favorite line I've heard this week in reference to the Packers practice in the snow when all the players were coming in, brushing themselves off, Jones was asked why he didn't have any snow on him. He simply moved out of the way whenever he sensed it, was his response. Now, I suppose you should expect that from a back who basically shared a backfield with Jamal Williams at one point. Also, I don't believe you're going to see any snow there in Miami, so that's probably something he's just practicing for the fun of it. Now, one more under-the-radar accomplishment as far as Aaron Jones is concerned. This is for the Packers fans out there. Aaron Jones has surpassed John Brockington from 1971 to 1977 for the 3rd place on the Packers all-time rushing list. Jones surpassed Brockington with 300 fewer carries. Just some food for thought about how good Aaron Jones has been, not only this season, but in his career. Now for Miami, poor Tua Tagovailoa. The fans love you, but it seems that your peers aren't quite there yet. Tagovailoa led all quarterbacks in Pro Bowl voting. However, the fan vote is only 1/3 of the mathematical formula, as the players and the coaches account for the remaining part of that equation, and they didn't have Tagovailoa as a top 3 signal caller in the AFC. At least he's not there yet. Now, Tyreek Hill, he continues to unlock greatness each and every week. Last week's touchdown marked the 7th time in which he has reached 7 touchdowns in a season, tying him with Randy Moss as the only receivers in NFL history to essentially have 7 or more touchdowns in 7 consecutive seasons. Turns out, not only can penguins perform in the snow, but cheetahs, hey, they can find a little bit of grip and get going too. Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill each found the end zone last week, with Waddle leading the way in the loss against the Buffalo Bills with 114 yards receiving on just 3 receptions. Green Bay has been one of the stingier teams in the league when it comes to allowing fantasy production to the wide receiver position this season. In the last 4 weeks, they are only allowing 23.2 fantasy points per game, having allowed just 356 yards and 2 touchdowns. That said, none of their opposition has had multiple pass catchers with more than 1,100 yards. Waddle and Hill, they're different dudes altogether. Now, Hill, he promised us he's going to be better after last week's contest against the Buffalo Bills, which seems crazy since he just made the Pro Bowl now for the 7th consecutive season, the 2nd longest active streak behind only Aaron Donald. And he's basically out-targeted Jalen Waddle by 34 targets over the last 8 games in which they've played together. If for whatever reason Tagovailoa decides he doesn't want to air it out this week, the Packers are a team that you can run the ball on. Over the course of the season and over the course of the last 4 weeks, they have allowed the 8th most fantasy points to backs this season, allowing over 25 fantasy points to the position over both of those time frames. Mostert there is coming off a 17 carry performance there against the Bills in the snow, in which he averaged 8 yards per carry. In the previous 4 contests, the Packers, they've surrendered 4 touchdowns and 360 yards on the ground. With that all being said, you've heard what I'm excited about this week. What are you excited about this week? What are the headlines? What are the matchups that you want to talk about? Get in the comments below and let me know. And I'm just going to throw this out there right now. A Fantasy Points subscription is the perfect stocking stuffer this time of the season. And with that super early bird rate before the Super Bowl, you get not only 30% off next season, but you get the rest of this season included as well. You can't get a better deal out there right now. You just want more deals? How about free? I love free. You love free. Everything about Christmas is free. Head over to the Fantasy Points YouTube channel because we got free video content there almost every day of the week, starting on Mondays there with the Monday grades with Wes Huber. That's coming at you at 9 a.m. Eastern. Tuesdays, plugged in DFS review with Scott Barrett and JM2Win. That's coming at you at 2 p.m. Eastern. Wednesday is the midweek mailbag there with Nick Script. And every Tuesday through Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern, grab yourself a cup of Joe, maybe some hot mocha, maybe a little hot chocolate because we're in the holiday spirit. Either way, grab yourself something there and sit down with Joe Dolan and the daily lineup, 9 a.m. Eastern. Again, that's Tuesday through Friday. And of course, if you're watching this show right now, you all know about the Friday Night Hype Show. We are hyped each and every week, and we are here for the holiday spirit. Let's go. Let's get at it, and let's have some fantasy championships delivered to you this Christmas, and we'll see you next week.